Hello everyone. After weeks and weeks of ignoring this one singular thing, I have finally taken action. I turned on this light. And speaking of things that I should have done forever ago and videos that I should have made forever ago, today we are going to be talking about Christopher Nolan's 12th film, Oppenheimer. As I just stated, Oppenheimer was directed by Christopher Nolan. It is his 12th film he has made, and it is a 3-hour-long biopic of the historical person of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer himself being a very famous physicist who is most known as the father of the atomic bomb. This film was released in the summer of 2023 alongside Greta Gerwig's Barbie film, sparking the very popular Barbenheimer trend. In my notes, I wanted to give a brief summary of the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer as an intro to this video, and what started off as a very quick summary of his life ended up turning into a very detailed, very comprehensive, and very long list of research into his life and his achievements. So I'm just going to briefly summarize all of the stuff that I wrote down. Also, in talking about Oppenheimer's life, I am going to be spoiling some events that are shown in the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet and don't want it spoiled for you, then I would skip to this timestamp, and that way you'll be safe from any spoilers. Following the work of Albert Einstein on general relativity, Oppenheimer went to study theoretical physics in Europe. And from there, he went on to do some very impressive work in general relativity and quantum field theory. After studying in Europe for a time, he took his knowledge and his practices and brought them over to America to start his own American school for theoretical physics. And during his time in America teaching theoretical physics, he co-authored several papers that were essentially pioneers in this new field. Their specific area of focus in these papers was on what happens to white dwarf stars when they collapse in on themselves, and this led to the theoretical discovery of what would later be known as black holes. And in 1942, Oppenheimer was recruited onto a very special project called the Manhattan Project. This project was tasked with one simple goal, and that was to build an atomic bomb before the Nazis did. At this point in time, with the research that physicists had put into the concept of nuclear power and nuclear energy, it became very quickly apparent that one could utilize this energy to build a bomb. And with World War II at its peak, the chief concern was that the Axis would be able to build an atomic bomb before the Allies. Oppenheimer was selected to head the project, and a central laboratory was made in the deserts of New Mexico called Los Alamos. This is a nuclear research facility that would remain in operation long after Oppenheimer's tenure there. In July of 1945, they conducted the Trinity test, which was the first ever successful detonation of a nuclear device. This was an event that Oppenheimer later recalled in an interview in 1965, wherein he cited the Bhagavad Gita when he quoted saying, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds."
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
I sure hope I said Bhagavad Gita right. If you say it with confidence, then people will believe you. After this successful detonation, 2 atomic bombs were given to the US Army from Los Alamos, and those were the bombs that were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And after this point, he dedicated his life to informing nuclear policy going forward. For a while, he was chairman of the advisory committee on the Atomic Energy Commission, which was created shortly afterwards. It seems after the detonations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he became incredibly fearful of the world that he had potentially created in inventing this device. And so he used his status as the father of the atomic bomb to inform policy and hopefully ensure that nuclear war would never be a possibility. However, there were many in government and the Atomic Energy Commission who wanted bigger arsenals. Their fear was if Russia, who was the big opponent at the time, were building up arsenals, then the only way to safely combat this was to have a large arsenal of their own. And so to remove Oppenheimer's voice from the equation, they brought up some events in his past in order to discredit him in front of the US government, particularly old ties to communist parties in America. See, this was during the Red Scare and the McCarthy era, so there was nothing that the US public and government feared more than communism. So his US security clearance was revoked, he lost his seat on the Atomic Energy Commission, and from there his public voice was largely stifled out. And from this point on, he largely disappeared from the limelight, only giving a few public speeches and making a few public appearances. He received some recognition, but nowhere near the level of recognition and fame that was associated with him before. And in 1967, having smoked his entire life, he passed away due to throat cancer. His life is very interesting and very tragic, but this is the life that is explored at length in Oppenheimer. The purpose of this video is this is going to be my review of Oppenheimer, my thoughts on Oppenheimer, both spoilery and non-spoilery, because in the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing more videos on Oppenheimer, whether it's the narrative structure that Nolan utilizes or some theories that I have coming out of the film. But this video is just to lay the groundwork, give you my thoughts on Oppenheimer as a whole, and my honest opinions on the movie itself. And I want to make it very clear, this video is going to be full of bias, and that bias is, I love this movie so much. This is my favorite Christopher Nolan film of all time. I don't claim to have seen all of Nolan's work, I've seen the majority of it, but I would say that this is the culmination of his entire career as a director. All of the traditional hallmarks of Nolan's style of filmmaking are brought to full realization in this film. And Christopher Nolan aside, the film Oppenheimer, I would argue, is the best film of the 21st century. At least so far. We've got a lot of century to go. So with that said, I hope that you stick around and I hope that you enjoy this review of Oppenheimer. For the channel, this is kind of a nostalgic return to that series Film Student Reviews I did a while back. I can't even call it Film Student Reviews anymore because I'm not a student anymore. I guess filmmaker reviews? Director review? I don't know. This is just going to be a review of Oppenheimer from someone who knows at least a little bit about what they're talking about. So maybe you've seen the film already, but you came away confused or have a lot of questions. Maybe you don't plan on seeing it and you're just searching the internet for other people's opinions on the film. Maybe you're like me and hearing someone talk about a subject or a film very passionately will inspire you to go see it for yourself. And whichever one of those best describes you, this video is going to lay the groundwork for a series I'm going to do on Oppenheimer going forward on so many different aspects of the film. So I hope that you'll stick around for this series. Whatever the case may be, thank you so much for watching, and we'll get into the video very soon.
But first, a word from our sponsor. I'm on a mission to make content creation my job, and to do that, I need your help. In the description, there is a link to my Patreon where you can support me in exchange for benefits, as well as a link to my Twitch channel where you can support me through subscriptions and bits, as well as a PayPal if you're feeling generous. Thanks for listening to my speech, and we're gonna get back to the video.
So the title of this video was correct. I have seen Oppenheimer in theaters 3 different times. This is something that just I as a person never do. If I go see a film in theaters, I only see it once. But My experience with Oppenheimer was so good, I had to see it 3 different times. The first time I went to see it, it was a normal digital screening of Oppenheimer. Me and a friend that I was going to see the movie with made the mistake of trying to look for IMAX tickets the day before we went, which was a bad idea, so we ended up having to go to the digital screening. And that first experience was phenomenal. I was blown away by the filmmaking, the cinematography of this film, as well as the soundtrack. The soundtrack was so impressive to me. And I'll get into detail on all of these things that I'm talking about either later in this video or in later installments of this series, so don't worry. And the story itself was very compelling and provoking. This film had a stacked cast, and all of them gave amazing, incredible performances. And the second and third times that I watched Oppenheimer, it was in IMAX 70mm film. For anyone who doesn't know, this film was released in an analog format, having been shot on film originally. Due to Oppenheimer's extensive runtime and the large format that is IMAX 70mm film, the final reel of Oppenheimer was 11 miles of film, and each reel weighed 600 pounds. And for the select theaters capable of projecting this movie on film, these 600-pound spools of IMAX film were delivered to these theaters, which would all be screened using an analog film projector. And not only is it authentic film, but IMAX 70mm is the largest screen format ever devised. And so my first experience of watching this film in IMAX 70mm, because this was also the first film I'd ever seen in that format, was incredible. It was the largest screen I had ever seen. Even sitting in the back of the theater, I was still craning my neck to get a view at the full picture. The picture dominated the entire wall of the theater. And you could also tell that what you were watching was projected from a spool of film. There was the light flickering of the frame, because film is just a series of frames passing very fast by a light source. And occasionally artifacts like hair and spots would appear on the picture, which gave it that authentic film look. It truly was a very special experience, especially in the modern digital age, because I didn't grow up watching films like this in this format. So the first time I watched it was in digital, and I was still blown away, but I was blown away several times stronger the second and third time watching this absolute masterpiece in IMAX 70mm format. But with all of that said, now I'm going to get into my non-spoiler thoughts on the movie as a whole. See, as the title suggests, this film is about the life and experience of Oppenheimer first and foremost. In fact, I don't think any movie has done such a great job of being 100% in the mind of its character that I've ever seen. Did that sentence make sense? I have no idea. There are many films that capture the subjective experience of a character, but this film lived and breathed in the life of Oppenheimer. It was so totally and completely his. And being a film about his life and his experience, that is the central focus of the film. While the story does talk about the bomb itself at length, much more time in the movie is spent on Oppenheimer and his thoughts and feelings during the whole thing. And when the bomb does finally go off, very little time is spent on it afterwards. While the explosion is very impressive and very well done, after it detonates, the film then refocuses on Oppenheimer. So if you're going to watch this film looking for a movie centered around the bomb, if you just want to see like a glorious explosion and that's what you came for, while I will say you will be satisfied with the explosion when it happens, you might be disappointed with the film as a whole, because very little screen time is given to the bomb. The majority of this film is about Oppenheimer. I feel like I keep repeating myself. These notes are probably the least structured notes I've ever used for one of these videos, so I apologize. But when the bomb does go off, it's incredibly satisfying. The sound design is incredible. The bomb was created using practical effects, and so when you're watching it, you are witnessing a real explosion. Not an atomic explosion, obviously, but a very real explosion. And as Nolan promised, I practically felt the bomb when the shockwave hit. It was very intense. It was a terrifying and strangely beautiful moment in the film. The other thing to note is this film is a combination of a biopic, a historical drama, and a courtroom drama. And thus, most of the film is talking, which I really enjoyed. I loved watching the story unfold through characters' dialogue with each other. It was very compelling to me, but this may not be compelling to someone who is expecting a lot of action from this movie. And of course, another big thing to bear in mind is that the film is 3 hours long, which is very intimidating considering most of that is talking. And I can totally understand why people would find that boring. But personally, I didn't think it was. Every scene that is shown, every dialogue that is had in the movie has its importance in the story. And the story was far too interesting for me to call it boring. That's really all I can say about this film from a non-spoilery standpoint. So from here on out, this is going to be my spoiler review of the movie. My thoughts on the movie that contains spoilers. So if you don't want to see spoilers for the movie at this point, even though it's been out for a few months now at this point, I would skip either to the end of the video or just stop the video here. One thing I really enjoy about this film is Nolan's use of the setup and payoff in his narrative. And that takes the form of certain shots that are seen and certain sound effects that are heard throughout the movie. We'll be given part of a shot at one point in a film only for us to see the resolution of that shot at the end of the film. Or there's a sound effect that we hear at different points in the film, but we don't know what's causing it or what's making that sound until later in the film. This is a technique that Nolan has used before in the past, but in Oppenheimer, it has a very real, very visceral impact. At least it did for me. For example, when we have really tense scenes about people at a table discussing the inevitability of nuclear war, Oppenheimer will start to stare dramatically into the camera and we hear this stomping sound fill the room around us. And as we find out, that stomping sound comes from a horrible moment in his life where he was forced to get on a stage and give a speech to people who were stomping and cheering for him as he gave a speech about how his device was used to kill hundreds of thousands of people. Before we get this resolution, the stomping is inherently very tense. But once we see who was making the stomping and the context for when the stomping occurred, it really drives the point home. He is terrified of the world that he's made, but the people still celebrate him, and he's horrified of that. We also see throughout the film these horrible visions Oppenheimer would have of the future that he potentially created. Shots of nuclear arsenals, rockets shooting into the sky, stuff like that. And all of these shots that we only see part of throughout the movie are then paid off at the very end in the very final beautiful scene of Oppenheimer. The final scene itself is a masterpiece. It is just a close-up of Oppenheimer's haunted face as he is tormented with visions of what he believes his legacy will be. In this sequence, all of the shots that we have seen throughout the film are shown in full, and it's meant to terrify us. I also love how the soundtrack of this film traces the character's journey. I don't know why I said character. Oppenheimer was a real person. The last time I listened to a soundtrack that so accurately traced not only the character's thoughts and emotions, but the journey that the character is taken on and the conflict that he encounters, it was when I listened to the soundtrack for The Joker. And I know that movie has largely been ruined nowadays by the Sigma community, but I stand by The Joker being a good film. Even if you just listen to the two tracks, Can You Hear the Music and Destroyer of Worlds, you get a sense of Oppenheimer's full character journey. Can You Hear the Music is a fantastic track that sings about the dreams and nightmares of this starry-eyed young scientist. This is who Oppenheimer was at the beginning of the film, a young scientist full of optimism and wonder for the world around him. And at the end of the film, in the final scene, Destroyer of Worlds plays. Both songs had the exact same melody, but Destroyer of Worlds is in a minor key. This perfectly reflects the jaded and terrified scientist that Oppenheimer is at the end of the film, as he fully believes that he may have unintentionally doomed the entire world. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this film was Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Louis Strauss. I thought he made a very compelling villain for the story, and Strauss's story in itself was very interesting. When he first met Oppenheimer, it was when he first arrived at Berkeley, and even then, that original scene when the two are very cordial and very friendly to each other, we see glimpses of Strauss's ego put on display. We don't know that he's the villain at that point. In fact, we think that he's a supporting character for Oppenheimer. But looking back on the film, you can see that they were laying the groundwork for his arc as the villain, even in that first scene. And in that first meeting, he walks in on Oppenheimer and Einstein having a conversation with each other. And when Einstein walks away and Strauss tries to greet him, Einstein gives him the cold shoulder. This is the crux for his arc as a villain, and the crux for the conflict that Oppenheimer finds himself in the movie. Strauss believed that Oppenheimer somehow poisoned Einstein against him, and so he held on to that resentment until finally it boiled over into him trying to undermine Oppenheimer so that his own agenda could be fulfilled. And of course, there were a few other humiliations that Strauss received at the behest of Oppenheimer, but this was the crux of his whole issue with him. He's a very effective antagonist in this film, particularly because you don't initially realize that he is the antagonist. Like I said, this is the start of a series on Oppenheimer where I'm going to go far more in depth into different aspects of Oppenheimer, the film, that I really loved and really enjoyed. But I believe that those ideas deserve their own separate videos because it felt wrong to sandwich them into a very long video where ideas may be glossed over. And so all of that to say, this is not my final word on Oppenheimer. There will be future installments of this series where I talk more about different aspects of the film. But in closing for this video, I want to bring up my one minor qualm with the film as well. I've sung this film's praises for this entire video now, and I believe it's well deserved. This is, as I've stated, I think the greatest film of the 21st century, but I do have one small issue with it. See, this film is full of very famous people, both famous actors in the modern age, as well as famous historical characters in the movie. And some of the treatment around these characters, like entrances into a scene or cameos in a scene, play off a lot like a cameo in a Marvel movie. I can't explain it better than that, but sometimes a character will be given like a dramatic entrance into a scene that feels very weird. Like there's a moment where Oppenheimer's getting dropped off at home, and when the car pulls away, it's revealed that Einstein is standing right behind the car. It's weird stuff like that. And of course, there's the moment at the very end of the film where Strauss is denied his application for Secretary of Commerce. This is kind of his big like defeat at the end of the movie, where like he discredited Oppenheimer and ruined his life, and now that's come to light, and now he in turn is being kind of like rejected. And when he asks who the votes against him were, one of his aides says that one of the people who voted against him was this young upstart senator who's trying to make a name for himself. And the dialogue kind of goes like, well, what's his name? Kennedy, sir. John F. Kennedy. Like, I don't know. It feels like a Marvel movie. And there's a few more examples too. Like I said, this movie is stacked with famous people and famous historical characters as well. And considering that's my only issue with this film, that's not a big issue. So with all that said, that is this week's video, which is my comprehensive overview of my thoughts on the film Oppenheimer. In future weeks, we are going to dive into the actual narrative structure the film uses, certain theories I have in terms of the techniques used to make this film. We will also talk about the technical marvel that this film is, because this film is in itself a feat of filmmaking. And we are also going to discuss the mythological implications that this film has and the literary sources that were used to inspire this film. I'm very excited for this Oppenheimer series, and I hope that you stick around. At least recording this video, I feel like I was all over the place talking about this film, and that's purely because this week's video was just my honest stream of consciousness thoughts regarding the movie. In future installments, I'm going to actually have like a message that I'm trying to communicate, or I'm going to try and explain certain takeaways from the film, because in traditional Nolan style, this film is meant to have you think about what it's saying at the very end. And I've come to several conclusions about this film that I cannot wait to talk about. But with all that said, I hope that you enjoyed this review of Oppenheimer, and I hope that you'll stick around for the rest of the series. And if you have stuck around for this long, thank you so much for watching. And of course, a huge thank you goes out to the patrons, Sean, and my top tier patrons, RD and Snowy. Thank you all so much for supporting me and supporting my content. It means the world. And if you want to join the Patreon yourself in exchange for certain rewards and benefits that are outlined on the page itself, the link is in the description. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week for the continuation of my series on Oppenheimer. I hope that you're excited for that, because I know that I am. And cut.